Well, welcome everyone that is joining us. A few more people might trickle in, but I want to go ahead and get started and be respectful of everyone's time. And thank you so much for everyone joining us on this Friday. And we're really excited. So we started, most of you have been here before, but just to kind of remind you, we started these cat chats honestly over the summer just as a way to process what was going on in the world, and things around social justice and racial inequality, and all these different issues that COVID and 19, and just processing all these big issues that are just kind of overwhelming, I think, to all of us. And so we wanted just to create a space for our community, students, faculty, staff, coaches, everyone, to come together and just have a little chat, have a little visit on a Friday afternoon as we wind down our week and kind of roll us into the weekend. So I'm Natalie, if I haven't got to meet you yet. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Business, and I'm focused in sport management, and I'm also the faculty athletics representative, so I kind of try to be a liaison between athletics and academics. And then we're really excited today. I'm going to let Doug introduce himself, and then we'll have our esteemed guest, Professor Patrick Catrell, is gonna kind of take the lead for us today. So we're really excited to have him. So Doug, you want to say aloha?
Yeah, well, aloha, happy Aloha Friday. You probably notice if you're here on every Fridays, I've got my aloha shirt, and I did an inventory. I have about enough shirts for every week of the year. So over the years, I've kind of collected those. But in any event, I'm Doug Heyer. I'm the Senior Associate Athletic Director here at Linfield. I'm also the Diversity and Inclusion Representative from the NCAA. I'm the designee. And I want to just add on to what Nat had said when we started this. I know for me, and probably typical a lot of males, is that we kind of internalize our feelings. We don't share those. But this platform has allowed not only myself, but others to engage and speak freely. And by doing so, it's allowed for me to identify myself and my feelings and be able to chat with people about how I feel and hear what others are feeling as well. So appreciate all of you being here and look forward to hearing our guest speaker.
Yes, thanks, Doug. And again, we also always like to make this a space where people feel comfortable sharing, and you can also just sit back. I kind of often tell people that it's kind of like a live podcast, so we're just kind of having a conversation and back and forth. And if you have questions specifically for Pat, feel free to either you can put them in the chat to everyone, you can put them in the chat directly to me, you can put them directly to Pat himself, or if you want to remain anonymous, we're totally cool with that. And we'll also allow some time to at the end if people want to kind of keep the conversation going. We try to keep it pretty free flowing and let people kind of take some time to process things. So with that, I want to introduce Pat Catrell, who's one of our awesome political science professors here at Linfield University. And Pat, I've only been here a year and a half, but I've gotten to cross paths with Pat several times on a ton of different kind of not issues, but just committees and different initiatives around campus. And I love his energy and his passion for sports as well as the students. And it's one of those experiences, I think, with many of our professors that are just like, man, I just would have had time to like take a class. And I actually was participating in the Pizza and Politics a couple of weeks ago after the first debate, and I really enjoyed that conversation. I was just thinking about our community as a whole. Like right now, I think we're all kind of been bombarded with messages about voting, and it's an election year, and I think we would be doing ourselves a disservice if we weren't to have some conversation and tap into Pat's expertise. So with that, I will let you take over, Pat, and I'll be here if anyone has questions or needs anything. And I just thanks again for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you, Natalie. Thanks to the CatChat team for inviting me here. This is such a great and important forum, and I'm very honored to be part of it. Let me just tell you a little bit about my background, which kind of informs where I'm going to go in the next half hour to 45 minutes. So I was a student athlete. I really see a lot of value in sports for life, for teamwork, for engaging with people who are different than you, come from different backgrounds than you. And it's been a huge part of my identity, and also as a sports fan. The second thing that informs my approach, and I thought I'd mention that just because I know this crew is largely, Noon Hoops at Linfield is one of the best things ever. Doug, you retired, you got to get back out there. You're still fit, you still look great. So the second thing is, before I became an academic, I worked in politics. I worked in Washington, D.C. At the U.S. Department of State. I was very interested in international politics, in part because I grew up, at least for the early part of my childhood, traveling around the world. My dad is career military. So I have some real world political experience, primarily in foreign policy, but also on Capitol Hill, where I was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff, working for Biden, actually, for a period of time, but as a professional staff member as opposed to a political person. It was a detail assignment. And then the third thing is, one of the big questions that motivated me to go back to get my PhD, to graduate school, a second round of graduate school, in addition to my desire to teach, which I find to be very meaningful, is the question about how can states or people from different identities and interests come together to realize common problems and mobilize the political will to help solve them. And so in that spirit, I hope to get at this question that Natalie and the CatChat team provided of what can and should we as student athletes, as faculty, as staff, do as very busy individuals to be responsible voting citizens. So in getting at this question, I'd like to invite you all on a collaborative, hopefully interactive journey that will take 3 stops. The first stop is going to ask, what do we mean by politics? What is politics? So let's just have a working definition of what we mean by politics, because when we vote, we are engaging in the political, okay? And why should we care about politics? Okay, that's stop 1. Stop 2. What do some of the political science nerds in the world, and we're an awesome group, we're fun and friendly, what do political scientists have to say about the sources of political polarization in the United States of America? And, this whole realm of political participation for some people can be very stressful, be very personal. And I think it's important for us as citizens to know what some of the experts say about those sources of division. And then the final stop is, what can we do about it as voting citizens? We live in a democracy. It means that the citizens are afforded power in society. So how might we exercise that power in positive, productive ways? All right. So I want you, please, to feel free to take Natalie up on her offer of using the chat function, sending questions at any time. Very happy to stop and engage, or use the hand raise function, or make some, use your emojis, whatever you'd like to do, and we can just have a conversation. I would like to make sure everyone's chat function is working by asking you to use it right now with a word association game. When you think about politics, what words come to mind? It can be any word. This is a total brainstorm. So just go ahead and start filling the chat function with any word that comes to mind. You can participate more than once, as many as you want. Great. Some really, really good ones here. So good. Lots of power, control. Oh, good. Tanya, way to go. Way to represent Tanya with something a little more positive. So one of the things that we do as political scientists is we try to explain and understand political outcomes, okay? One of the things we might do to do that is employ something called content analysis, which I'm not going to go into methods very much here, but what we might do if we were political scientists is look at these words and code them for whether they have a positive connotation, a negative connotation, or a neutral connotation. And if you would look at the words, Doug, if you look at the words here, it looks like our group with the possible, there are a couple of more neutral ones like negotiation. Maybe a more positive one might be bipartisanship. Thank you, Tanya. But the vast majority of them are negative, right? They have kind of a negative context. So we have this negative connotation of politics. And this is actually reflected in trust in government among the electorate, among American citizens. So if I were to ask you, I was going to poll you guys, but I didn't get the poll function up and running the time, so I will just ask you in your mind to think about if how many Americans, the Pew Foundation does a regular poll that take the barometer of US public opinion, and one of the regular questions they ask is, what describes your feeling toward US government? And they have 4 possible: angry, frustrated, content, or mostly content, or don't know, don't care. And what percentage of people would you think in America are currently angry or frustrated with government? And I will tell you the answer. The answer is 24%, this is September 2020, 24% are angry, 57% are frustrated, and 18% are content, okay? Moreover, if you ask a poll, do you trust the government to do the right thing just about always, most of the time, some of the time, or never, only 20% of Americans today say they trust the government in Washington to do what is right just about always or most of the time, okay? And just about always is only 2%, okay? One of the things that's interesting about this is that this has been stable over the course of time. This is not a product of the current presidency. This is, these attitudes have been tracking more with increased polarization as opposed to a single administration. Okay, so I promised you a definition of politics, and the definition I'm going to give you actually tracks quite a bit with what your, especially those people who put down the word power. It's not really a negative definition, and there's several definitions out there, but I find that my students find this one by Clay Shively to be useful. And he writes, politics always involves the making of common decisions for groups of people, and those decisions are made by some members of the group exercising power over other members of the group. So, in other words, 2 factors, okay? 1, decision-making for a group, for a collective, and 2, the exercise of power by some members over others, okay? As it turns out, these decisions matter a lot, a lot. We're all immersed in this 2020 election. We're occupied by the flooded media cycles, the fanfare, the horse race politics. But there are a lot of critical issues, quote unquote, on the ballot, as we're hearing lots of different campaign folks say, including the health of our democracy, our economy, our livelihoods, basic questions of human rights, climate change, and public health, among others, okay? So in short, politics are important because they affect your life and all of those you love and everybody in the country, okay? But even though politics are important, these issues, people tend to, use this mistrust in government or this negative connotation to justify not being involved. These problems are all seem very intractable. What can I do? People throw up their hands, and they are increasingly becoming difficult to talk about with people with different and very personal and intense political views. So it can lead to some very uncomfortable conversations. And so this leads to the stop number 2, which is, what are some of the sources of political polarization that everybody kind of mentioned in the chat function, several of you mentioned. Let me define polarization first. So polarization is a process by which the normal multiplicity of differences in a society increasingly align along a single dimension. And people increasingly perceive and describe politics and society in terms of us versus them. Okay? Now, I want to go back to, I want to ask, what explains polarization we're seeing in American society today, and then hopefully provide some suggestions on how to mitigate these sources. But before I do that, I'd like to ask you to participate in the chat function again. And I would like you, if you wouldn't mind, to brainstorm again, very briefly, as to what divides us. What divides America? Great stuff. I'm hoping everybody is reading the chat function. I'm not going to repeat everything. But I will relate what I'm about to say back to some of them. Great. Okay. There's lots here. Great, Mike. That's good. So good. Okay. So there's a lot to unpack when it comes to understanding polarization, and in this short time period, it's impossible. If I mean, courses, year-long courses are taught around this. But I'm going to talk about 3 different factors, and that are, I think, important for us to be mindful of. The first factor is, as a lot of people allude to, is kind of is cultural. What is the #1 determinant of voting behavior, you may ask? Well, the answer is quite simple. It is partisan identification, party identification. And where does party identification come from? Well, one of the primary factors is upbringing, how you're socialized into the world. And partisanship is part of the lived experience of many people. It becomes very deeply personal. Okay. What's interesting is, as the country is becoming more hyperpolarized, people are hardening their party affiliations. Let me give you a couple of anecdotes that will illustrate some of where this is going. So in 2016, there's a really interesting Washington Post poll in Virginia, okay? And it found in October 2016 that 60% of respondents who planned to vote for Hillary Clinton did not know a single family member or close friend who planned to vote for Donald Trump. Similarly, 54% of Trump voters did not have a family member or close friend who planned to vote for Hillary Clinton. So there's a cultural disconnect. And it's all the more notable given that Virginia has traditionally been one of those purple states that could go either way, right, in an election. I'd like to cite another study that I think is quite interesting. That's an example of how some of the narratives that are happening around party identification coalesce. There's a book called The Politics of Resentment by Kathy Kramer. And she teaches at the University of Wisconsin, a former professor of mine, actually. And what she did is this really cool study where, she's from, liberal Madison, and takes her Prius and drives out into rural Wisconsin. And what she does is she sits in coffee shops, gas stations, diners, and listens to conversations that people are having and take notes. So she has a very kind of anthropological approach to her political science research. And, she was trying to understand where this kind of the disconnect between the rural red parts of Wisconsin and the blue or urban parts of Wisconsin. And, it's interesting, having lived in Wisconsin myself, There are some parallels to Oregon, I think, in important ways. But I'm going to read an excerpt. This wasn't really about the 2016 election. It was more about reactions to Scott Walker, who was a very polarizing governor in Wisconsin. But here's what Kathy wrote. In Wisconsin, as was true across the nation, there was a very strong rural turnout and a not so strong urban turnout. And in our rural areas, what I've learned is that there are many people who feel that neither party represents them, and many have a strong resentment toward the cities and urban elites. They feel as though they're not getting their fair share of power. No one is really listening to them. They are not getting their fair share of taxpayer dollars. The money goes to the cities. And also they're not getting their fair share of respect. People assume folks in small towns are ignorant and racist. That mix of resentment is pretty fertile ground for a right-leaning populist candidate. Okay, so when Hillary Clinton, probably the biggest mistake she made in her campaign, this so-called basket of deplorables, right, comment, didn't work too well in some of those populations. I hasten to add that this is a two-way street. You can make a similar claim, in other areas, but that's a representative example. And for this, a third thing about the kind of culture, political culture, and partisan culture, is there's a third study by Dan Hopkins called "The Increasingly, How and Why Political Behavior is Nationalized." And basically, he claims, and this is that politics have become a spectator sport, and politics have become more nationalized. Issues are more likely to be argued and adjudicated at the national rather than the local level, which stands at kind of at odds with the historical intent of our framers, who envisioned that political power would favor states and municipalities. Voters know that state and local government have real effects on their lives, yet they consistently report being much more interested in paying attention to the presidency, which is one of the reasons why you see turnout, is very different for presidential elections. And the implications of this is that at one level, politics based on team loyalty ceases to serve political purposes. It may be entertaining, but it makes the working of coalitions to confront specific problems very difficult. And anybody who wants to cooperate with elements on the other side of, say, healthcare reform or education reform are viewed as giving aid and comfort to the enemy. And so this makes the task of passing laws and conditions more secondary. Okay? So that is one area we think about partisan culture. The second area that I think is important for people to know as citizens, explaining and understanding polarization, is the role of the media. The role of the media. Research, there's a lot of research, and we have several people on the faculty who are far more experts on this than I am, and Dimitri Kelly in my department, Kevin Curry, others. But let me just give you some of the basic highlights. Research shows that partisan media increases negative partisanship and effective polarization toward the opposition, which is part of the problem, right? So the media compounds this partisan culture. And moreover, and this is really interesting, people who were exposed to partisan media only secondhand, that is, they didn't watch it themselves, but they heard about it from someone else or saw it on social media, those are even more polarized than the people actually exposed to the media. Okay, this is, one of the reasons this is because media is a profit-driven business, and the demands of advertisers is giving people the priority of what they want, rather than fulfilling some dream about a democratic function to inform citizenry. So there is this kind of media as the fourth check, the fourth institution, the check on power. But the capitalism that people mentioned in the chat earlier on, is a strong deterrent to providing that function. A lot of you, I don't know how many people here saw Leonard Pitts on campus. Leonard Pitts is a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist from the Miami-Dade Herald. And it was the only time I've been in ICE auditorium and seen a standing ovation for a guest speaker. And what he said was, that got the applause is as follows. The issue is simply is not simply that we do not have the facts. It is that we do not want the facts. It is that we refuse to engage them. So the argument is that we as citizens are complicit in this polarization. It is that we refuse to engage them, that we actively reject anything that does not comport what we have already chosen to believe, trying to turn lies into truth by sheer repetition of hammering lies like nails, echoed and magnified by a network of bloggers and radio talk show hosts and TV pundits, brazen falsehoods that fly in the face of science and history and facts and decency. It threatens grave and profound damage to the intellectual life of the nation, to our ability to simply be thinking and responsible members of the American electorate. And what Pitts refers to is the culture of so-called doublespeak, the ability to lie, whether knowingly or unconsciously, and get away with it. The ability to use lies and choose and shape facts selectively, blocking out those that don't fit an agenda or program. And this leads, this coupled with the partisanship, leads to a perception that all news sources, that Fox News and the New York Times are equal. When in fact, if you look at journalistic standards, they are not. But if you can't agree on basic facts as a society, how do you hold people accountable for their actions, right? One of the things I think that we should all be concerned about in government right now, regardless of people's political affiliation, is how whistleblowers are being handled in the current administration. If you realize the inspector generals and most major agencies, which are the people that are supposed to be responsible for holding elected officials, politically appointed officials accountable for their actions, accountable to the oath of office they take, to loyalty to the US Constitution, they're being fired and replaced by, and they're traditionally nonpartisan positions. So accountability is a real issue. But guess what the biggest source of accountability is in the United States of America? The ballot box. The ballot box. In a democracy, the people have the ultimate say on what moves forward. And so I think the third thing that's important to be mindful of is paying attention to our voting structures, which is one of the big variables that political scientists examine. Okay. When we think about electoral institutions, we hear a lot about the role of money in politics, campaign finance reform. We hear a lot about gerrymandering. So there's a lot about our electoral system that deserves scrutiny. But let's focus on the basics of voting. And here are some storylines. One storyline is inequality in terms of access. Voter suppression has been around in the United States for a long time, and it's still around. Witness, just as an example over the last couple months, the efforts to remove mailboxes in states, so it makes it harder for people to submit a ballot, ostensibly, right? So that's one. Think about foreign interference in election, which has been a new thing with the findings of the bipartisan commissions in Congress and the FBI and intelligence community, that Russia did in fact interfere in the 2016 election and is continuing to do so today. Think about inequality in terms of representation. According to a recent report by the Roosevelt Institute, Wyoming's 583,000 residents enjoy as much power in the Senate as nearly 40 million residents of California. So in electoral college terms, that ratio of power is 4-1. 18% of the American population, which is on average whiter and older than the rest of the population, can elect a majority of the Senate. And if those senators are not united in their opposition to a piece of legislation, the filibuster enables even a smaller group of them, representing 10% of the population, to block it. Should legislation by a vast majority of the American people somehow make it past these hurdles, the Supreme Court, selected by a president representing a minority of the population and approved by senators representing an even smaller minority, can overturn it. So according to Corey Robin, who's a great political theorist, quote, "The problem of minority rule, in other words, isn't Trumpian or temporary, it's bipartisan and enduring." And I mention this because the structural fights to reinforce, reinforce polarization. When we talk about the Supreme Court, when we talk about, whether the election will be legitimate, this is all about being able to control the electoral structures and, guess what, remain in power, okay? Or assume power, depending on your perspective. So this situation looks pretty bleak, I will admit. But same poll, most Americans believe that trust in government can be restored. And the question is, how? And so this is our third and final stop, and I'll be very excited for any discussion after this. But what can we do as citizens to contribute to restoring the trust in government, maybe to reducing polarization, maybe to help fix our electoral system? Well, I would like to start with kind of a bold claim. And that our central problem as a country is not one of division, it's one of conformity. People are either cynical, so they don't participate, or very politically active segments of society on the left and on the right seem to lack a willingness to engage people of different political views, to be open-minded, to be willing to listen or to question their own received wisdom. So this bitterness in the post-fact world becomes the new normal. And so I think that one of the big antidotes that we have as a society, as citizens, is to recognize that no lasting change is going to be possible, and the depth of change that we need as a country to fulfill the promise of the Constitution, of basic equity, of human rights, of complex problems like climate change and so forth, it's going to require a significant degree of cooperation. So here are a few suggestions. Point one, start engaging these conversations. I mean, I understand that from students that I hear that a lot of times people with different political perspectives get frustrated. They don't want to talk to, they feel marginalized, and politics becomes so personal and emotional. And that's understandable because we're all have our own lived experiences that inform our perspectives and the way we see the world. But one of the hallmarks of a liberal arts education is to learn to reach across multiple human perspectives. So politics is characterized by conflict, but that conflict doesn't necessarily have to be bad. It can be constructive. So the first thing to do in this kind of remembering humanity and engaging people is to recognize the type of conflict that might exist. Is it positional? Is it ideological? Is it personal? We would do well to be flexible, right? Recognizing that these issues, a lot of them are subjective. To the extent that we don't personalize these issues, but retain commitments to our principles to be fair, firm, and kind in dealing with them, we can, I think, arrive at some sort of common ground. Because what's happening, by the way, when we talk about the media, so a lot of people get their news from Twitter feeds or from Facebook or others. And what happens then is your reality is reproduced because the ads you get, everything else that you get is being, the artificial intelligence is catering your screen world to you. But what it's not doing is showing you the full picture, right? You're getting a very personalized, cropped picture, okay? And so in order to break out of that, one way is to start engaging people with different perspectives and learn to listen well. And I have some strategies for good listening if people want to talk about that in the Q&A, but I won't do it now. Point two, let's say you're engaging in these conversations. Reintroduce complexity to the issues. You are all members of a community that is grounded, again, in liberal arts. And this means you getting knowledge from different backgrounds and skill set to be able to do this, and it's a luxury to have. It's a privilege to have. So in how to reintroduce complexity, well, the first thing to do is educate yourself. I don't know where you get your news, but I would suggest that you look at multiple sources. So I look at the New York Times and the Washington Post every day, but I also look at the Wall Street Journal, which has those editorial boards are, slightly left-leaning, right-leaning, but you have to separate the editorial boards from the actual journalistic standards. And all of those publications have high journalistic standards. Consider some international perspective. BBC is a good example. Public radio, which is funded publicly, which in theory gets at some of these bigger issues that we were talking about in terms of what motivates networks for their content. Try to get local news, state news, and national news. Local newspapers recognize, going back to this question about nationalized politics, the biggest difference you can make is at the local level. It's not at the national level. And so I would also advise, I think it's common to limit or avoid hyper-partisan sources of news. In 2017, this is funny, The Onion introduced a satirical current events talk show called You're Right. And in it, the host feeds viewers their own beliefs and biases, assuring them that they are right and those that disagree are stupid and evil. And while it's a parody, like many things these days, Saturday Night Live and The Onion, it just doesn't feel very much like a parody. It brings emotional satisfaction to hear experts and famous people saying things you agree with and denouncing those with whom you disagree. But it also has harmful effects on your relationships and turns out leaves you poorly informed. So that's one. Another step is to complicate the narrative. Okay, so complicating the narrative relates very closely to reintroducing complexity. They're modifying the same idea. But there's a lesson in working amid what seems like intractable conflict, which is that, when you introduce complexity, it leads to a fuller, more accurate story, and it boosts the odds that our inquiry or conversations will matter, especially if it's about a polarizing issue. Because when people encounter complexity, they have a tendency to become more curious and less closed off to new information, and more likely to listen, in other words. So let me give you an example. I asked you what divides us, okay? And I did this on purpose because there's a great article that's called Complicating the Narratives that uses as a foil everybody's favorite talk show host, Oprah Winfrey. And a few years ago, Oprah, in 2017, brings together a group of Americans from different political backgrounds and views. And this is for 60 minutes. And her opening question was, how is President Trump doing in his job so far? And this question, according to the article, is terrible, because what it does is it's closed, it's simplified, and everybody automatically indexes to the president, who is in and of himself a very polarizing figure, right? So already the chances of complicating the narrative become much more, stark. Instead, by asking what is dividing us, the conversation becomes about the division, and the president doesn't become a black hole where all the complexity is going to get dumped, right? So it changes the filter. Widening the lens, right? So, when people, people have a tendency to describe, if you take the politics of resentment, their stories in the same way as Kathy described it. So if you want to mediate, you try to flip that over and say, how did you come to that? Why is this story important to you? How do you feel when you tell it to me? And while these questions seem a little touchy-feely, it's surprising how rarely people get asked them. What is oversimplified about this issue? How has this conflict affected your life? What do you think the other side wants? What's the question nobody is asking? These are all examples contained in this article on Complicating the Narrative that I think are useful strategies to think about how to engage people that are different than you. Point 3, last point, get involved. Okay, I know we're busy. Heaven knows my bandwidth issues are horrible. So the first thing you can do is vote. Voting is so important, and it's important to vote in every election, not just national elections. If you are informing yourself on a semi-regular basis and working it into your routines, as described earlier, your vote is going to matter a lot more on a local level in terms of determining outcomes than it will on a national level. But even so, as I mentioned, the lone source of accountability that Americans have in federal government is the ballot box, right? That's the biggest source. There's a website. You should make sure that you have access to voting. You should vote early. You should make sure you get your ballots. There's a website called whenweallvote.org. I will put it in the chat. Whenweallvote.org. That is the one-stop shop for how to register, when the deadlines are. By the way, October 13th, voter registration deadline for Oregon. If you're not registered, now is the time. Like today, like now. Go to the site, it'll link there, and there's other resources if you want to volunteer to poll, if you want to do other things on election day. Second thing you could do is what we already do. Linfield is really outstanding at being involved in the community. And I can tell you, I'm serving on the General Education Review Committee with Natalie here, and we're hoping to be able to make that even more part central to the Linfield student experience. Some part of community engagement, community service, service learning. It's interesting because the political is not just about Washington or Salem. You engage in the political all the time. If you're working with a nonprofit foundation, if you're trying to make a difference in people's lives, usually that involves budget and decision-making over scarce resources. Well, political, if you think about that definition, right? Those local level things is where, as noted before, the biggest difference can be had. And to the extent that, you feel like there's structural issues facing the country, that would be a really good way, on a more national level area, to get involved. I'd like to conclude with a quote, and it's a quote from Bobby Kennedy, RFK, who is the Attorney General under the John F. Kennedy administration and a presidential candidate in 1968. And his response to me was, I think, quite poignant, because this is the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated. And he said, quote, "What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence or lawlessness, but love and wisdom and compassion toward one another and a feeling of justice towards those who still suffer within our country. Let us dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and to make gentle the life of this world." And I would submit to you that as students at a liberal arts institution, with all of the resources we have at our disposal, that we bear a special responsibility to follow in this path. And so with that, thank you for listening and your attention and your great participation in the chat room. And I would love to chat and hear what everyone has to say.
Well, Pat, I got some questions I want to share. Maybe this will start some conversation, but when I think about politics, my wife used to work for a U.S. Senator in Oregon. And we would have discussions, and a lot of things I learned from her, because to me, there's a lot of things that, grow up in Hawaii, and of course coming here in Oregon, it just doesn't make sense to me. I remember when I had to register to vote, I had to pick a party. And I go, why? Why can't I just vote for the person who's the best person, who I believe is the right person, And then the other thing we have the same conversation over and over, is even when we get to the presidential nomination, the person that's going to represent the party, we in Oregon, we see all these polls kind of like, I never participated in the polls. We have no voice in who that person is. And then locally to the national, voting, locally, it's the popular vote. All our votes do matter, but nationally for the presidential election, our vote sometimes it doesn't matter. It's really determined based on those swing states. So I always thought, doesn't make sense, So a lot of times, like my mom never voted because she really felt like it doesn't matter, But I finally got her to register, so she's going to vote for the first time ever. So anyway, those are some of the things that have been on my mind. And sometimes people feel like the system's flawed. Your vote doesn't matter. Why vote? In essence, it really does. So,
I mean, do other people? Thanks, Doug. I mean, in Hawaii, politics are really different too. I mean, it's such an interesting state. I mean, my dad currently lives in Hawaii and has lived there for several years, and so I'm kind of familiar with Hawaiian politics, it's different as well. But do other people feel the same way? That does what Doug's saying resonate with others? Because I've heard this. These are very common. Yeah, Mike is. Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, but here's the thing. If there are lots of you want to know if you're able to vote the candidates once elected at a local level there's a lot more space for change to happen, right? I mean, and we're at if we don't vote the candidates into office that are going to pursue the interests of the citizenry, then that's when the system begins to break down. I mean, imagine if this became, there's several debates. Some people say it's okay if there's a debate within political science that says, hey, if you're not interested in voting, then don't vote. And that's good because you're probably less informed and probably this and that, and so forget it. But what happens if that hits a tipping point? Whose voices end up mattering more, right? And that is part of the reason that reinforces some of the structural issues that we're faced with today.
So I want to follow up with my comment there. Even in a primary, if you're voting locally for an office, it's got to go to a runoff in November. If you can't vote along party line, if you're forced to vote along party lines, you may not be able to vote for the person you actually want to vote for in the first place, which may leave him or her out of the opportunity to run for office in November. So I guess that's where I'd like to know where the history of that came from and why we can't vote for who we really choose to vote for in May to help us vote the way we want to vote in November.
It's a great question. I want to caveat this by saying there are people who have a lot more expertise than I do on voting structures and political behavior. But there are this varies by state, Mike. I mean, there are open and closed primaries, right? And so the thing is, if you're an independent, and what he's getting at, and you have a big, let's go back to say Obama, Hillary, or whatever in a primary scenario, you don't even get to vote on that to see who goes into the final, and then you will ultimately get to vote, but you don't have any influence. And so you're stuck if you don't identify firmly with either party, right? And that's problematic. There's a lot of people, one of the most common papers I get and for the reasons you articulate, Mike, you're right. One of the most, I would encourage you guys to look at the main electoral system, which is ranked choice ballots. So you get everybody there and then you rank them in order. And that's how things candidates are chosen to move forward. And so there are lots of reforms that, and this gets a bit at Doug's questions too, points, because, the way that our ballots are structured and the way our politics are run, big money, so on and so forth, it's not that people are cynical for no good reason. They are, because the odds that their vote in a national election will matter are infinitesimal, right? But I guess what I was getting at earlier is the more we engage in the process and communicate to the elected officials that we don't like our voting system and that this is a pathway to restore trust in government by maybe changing some of these things. That is going to be, that can be influential. And, you know, another debate that we have a lot is whether, and there's some real disagreement in the political science department over this, is the viability of a third party. Why are we stuck in this red or blue world? How do you break out of the red or blue world? When in fact, we should be looking at issue by issue, right? Each issue is super complex. And why are we indexing to, well, this is what the Republican Party wants or what the Democratic Party wants? That's not good public policy. Good public policy is really diving into the issue, because, you know, there's probably good insights from different political perspectives to leverage, but they never get aired. I'll give you an example. Trans-Pacific Partnership, trade agreement between, this is my area that I have some expertise in foreign policy. There's a huge trade agreement on the table between the United States, Vietnam, Japan, others, like 18 states that would have been, you know, represented over half of the world's GDP in a free trade agreement with the United States. United States is in, China is out. Very good by most studies. Well, guess what? In the last campaign in 2016, no candidate supported it. So it was all one-sided, and there was no debate, because the United States, even though Hillary Clinton's State Department negotiated. So these are problematic, the way that the elections are structured, and, you know, it leads to simplicity instead of complexity. But Mike, in Oregon, if you want to, I mean, I'm sure there are people trying to mobilize to change the voting structure, so that might be something to engage and educate on. I mean, this is, which I don't know. We can look it up, but it'd be cool. And we can, as Linfield, you know, provide events to help do this.
Yeah, and like you say, sometimes that even comes down to voting in a local election where you want to support somebody, possibly in the other party, if you're you know, engaged in a certain party. And it's like voting for the person you think is going to be the best for the environment that person's being voted into.
Exactly.
Whether it's a county commissioner or a mayor in a Republican mayor in a liberal city that needs to have some vested change and stuff like that.
Yeah, I don't know how, have you guys, I mean, Jay mentioned this yesterday when we were meeting in the run up to this. Have you guys taken a look at your voter pamphlet yet? I just got mine in the mail yesterday. It's amazing, you know, I actually take like 2 hours of time and read through all the kids, because I've never heard of most of these local candidates before, right? I mean, I'd never even heard of them. I don't know what and then the same things that Doug came up, like, well, I live in this district that is, you know, overwhelmingly, you know, going to vote this way anyway. So why would I even vote or engage in these questions? But I still think the process of informing yourself is important. I mean, both for knowing that you're taking an active role as a citizen and being knowledgeable on the issues and responsible, and also because it bleeds into other areas. So for example, you could, if you know that these issues are on, outside of election season, you can have a lot of influence mobilizing around local or state-based legislation. I mean, Tanya's husband, Sal, is great at this and has had a lot of experience, and he's a wonderful resource. And we have other resources within the Linfield community on this as well. In fact, Sal's way more knowledgeable on this stuff than I am.
Pat, thank you so much. But gosh, I have so many questions. I'm trying to think of which will be the most relevant to everyone on the call. But I'm just curious your kind of perspective. I always lose an AirPod here. On, you know, people with sports, they often, well, and a lot of things, they often say, well, you know, you got to keep the politics out of sports. And like Michael Jordan was kind of famous for always saying, you know, Republicans buy sneakers too, so I can't, like, you know, be polarizing in that way. What just this last year with, you know, kind of seeing the movement within professional sports, even college sports, like what is just, I guess, your take on how the keep politics out of sports perspective, and for those of us on the call, your thoughts.
Impossible.
Yeah.
It's my first thought. I get the arguments, you know, the integrity of the game, let's just play. and focus on that purity. And I agree. I mean, I love that. That's the great thing about sports. But when the more you pan out and look at this, the fact that, look, youth sports is political. Access to a club team, a travel team, the keeping up with the Joneses. I mean, I coach youth sports. It's amazing how the disparity shows up in youth sports. If you think about the fact that sports are a $1 trillion global industry, if you think about that sports have provided a platform, we sing the national anthem at sports. It's nationalistic. Military planes fly over football games. Is patriotism decoupled from the political? Well, I mean, it's certainly a contested question. And sports provide one of the best platforms to raise awareness and dialogue. I mean, there's, from the Olympics to, football games across. So I think it's unavoidable. The relationship between sports and politics is inextricably linked. And I would argue that it goes even deeper. I mean, we're talking about this as a spectator sport, allegiances to teams. But I do think, I think that you can make some important parallels between sports and politics. But I also think that sports actually has a lot of healing. For myself and many people I know, it's one of the primary ways where I've met friends, lifelong friends who are really different than me. There are common rules to the game that we accept. And I mean, imagine if Washington behaved as, when the referee speaks, usually people follow even though refs make bad calls, nobody fires the ref mid-game. There's lots of uses of sport analogy, I think, that can be used to kind of animate some of the political. I mean, what happens if, the Kansas City Chiefs won the Super Bowl last year? Great job, Kansas City. And they get the #1 draft pick. How's that? Is that fair? That's sure what society feels a lot like for people who are on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, right? So I think there's a lot of interesting ways to explore the relationship between sport and politics. And so I just don't think that, as much as we want to just focus on the sports as entertainment or sports as, an athletic endeavor in the kind of broad societal lens, which you can do, right? An isolated, but in a broad societal lens, inextricably.
Yeah, I agree. Evan, I think Evan has a question. Go ahead, Evan.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something on that topic. I think, especially in the last couple months with all the protests going on and all the athletes in the NBA and other professional organizations advocating for social justice and stuff. And a big argument there is that it's not political at all. It's basic human rights. And that, I think that's a really big kind of idea that's been going around.
Thanks, Evan. I think you're right. And that's part of that framing, I think, has led to, think about the successes. The actual actions, outcomes. This is one of the, if you look at some of the, Confederate flags are banned at NASCAR events. NBA owners are opening up arenas for voting. These are big outcomes that haven't happened in earlier protests, right? So I do think, now, and we could, if people want to talk about, is it different now? Is it same but different? Is it not? But I do think those are great points. And I've been quite, and even last week, Landon, if you look at the debate, the presidential debate, the president, one of the lines that I remember the most from the debate was, "I brought back football," politicized, right? Or the very next day, you have Landon Donovan's minor league soccer team. Landon Donovan's one of the U.S. men's national team greats, arguably the greatest player ever. He's coaching a team in San Diego, and the opponent allegedly used a homophobic slur against one of his players, and they walked off the field in protest. I mean, this is, sports are increasingly providing the, the background, the stage for where a lot of these social issues are and debates are happening. Social change and the debates around it are happening, which is important because it's reaching more people than it otherwise would, because most people don't turn into the news on a nightly basis anymore, right? So that's one of the reasons why sports as a stage is so, I think, influential.
Yeah, I have to agree 100%. I have a hard time, especially this semester, teaching about sport without talking about I always like to talk about current events, and it's hard to talk about without talking about those issues, and trying to present them in a way that isn't, trying to enforce my views or my values on students. But I also was curious too. One of my students was on earlier, and she mentioned that she sent me a chat message. She was just like, how everyone's obsessed with reality TV. We're one of the points you were talking about. I think kind of talking about how sports is becoming more open to these discussions, and then, but also the fact that it is, I feel like the political, what's happening in Washington and what's happening nationally is it's like a kind of a reality TV show that sometimes media just gets, it's just for lack of a better term, wildfire, and they just kind of run with things. Any thoughts on kind of that kind of, I feel like it's like fetishization of politics almost.
It is. It's funny. I wrote occasionally I just get, I feel like ranting. And so, and I just draft up op-eds that I never send anywhere. And one of the ones that I wrote was a kind of satirical piece. And this gets at Mike's thing earlier, actually, a bit, is so you want a POTUS, and instead of having our election system the way it is, which is kind of crappy, why not get the best and brightest of Americans and have a reality show that would determine who made the ballot instead of the current process. And, of course, it can never happen for a lot of reasons. But if you think about it as a thought experiment, if you have two rules, no ad hominem attacks, and two, no, you can't talk about party identification. You have to treat ideas on merits, right? So each week you tackle an idea, education reform. So you hear all the ideas on education reform. So we tune in, we're watching it, and then we vote candidates off the island until we end up with our top four or whatever, and then they get to go to and then they get sponsored on the ballot with Republicans and Democrats, right? But if you think about that, there are elements to the reality TV, or the fetishization of politics that can be good insofar as they're engaging populations that wouldn't otherwise be engaged, and especially if they're doing it in ways that present countering viewpoints, right? The problem is, though, quick story that you guys might find amusing. So my fantasy football draft, I call my commissioner and I say, hey, what happens if, COVID and the season gets canceled? What do we do? Do people get paid or not? What's going on? And he goes, this is a high school friend of mine I played football with in high school. And he's like, dude, I almost didn't even want to have a league this year. I said, why? And he goes, Drew Brees. And I say, what's wrong with Drew Brees? And he's like, Drew Brees said it's okay to kneel at games, and I just don't agree with him. And I was like, so you're not going to do fantasy football? And it was just, oh my gosh, this is it typifies, the way a lot of people look at this question, the relationship between sports and politics. He's somebody that thinks that they should be decoupled, and the kind of reality show element that, when you just have, a very narrow set of people that you hang around with, or I know his family, very conservative, evangelical background, it informs your views, And so we had an interesting conversation. I tried some of my tactics, and I can tell you that they only worked with very, very limited success.
But I think the fact that you try to have these dialogues, and I think that's what we are trying to do here at Linfield, is just let's just try to have some critical thinking and have where it's not just two sides spitting out things, but actually trying to listen. I think I love how we kind of have the space to do that. And no, that's such a funny, I love that story, because I think we actually talked about the Drew Brees thing over the summer in one of our chats. And I liked that example too, because I think also, you know, this cancel culture that we live in now, that, you know, I think we need to allow people to fail more, and like allow people to like change their initial kind of, you know, and like pulling out one tweet or one post or one thing, you know, it's like you have to have some context, I think, for a lot of that, and people need to be able to kind of live and learn, because I think that's, yeah. But I think that's really great. Doug, I know people are hopping off for other meetings, but if anyone wants to jump in with a question or comment, or feel free. I also love what you were talking about with the what is it, the rank choice. Yeah, I hadn't heard about that until the summer, and I was just like, oh my gosh. And that's the kind of things I think too, that like for so long I accepted basically the government and politics as it is, and it's like, well, actually maybe there's not only maybe better ways, but also ways we can actually make it happen, make those changes. And I do think I'm really excited by our community here, and like just the younger generation too, with all the resources they have access to like just be more informed. But
yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, I know people have to go, but the last thing I'll say, unless other people want to keep talking, is that, you know, I really do think that to piggyback on what you're saying about what we do at Linfield, there are cool concepts out there, like John Rawls' veil of ignorance. You know, you imagine yourself, you're trying to evaluate a policy, and imagine yourself, you don't know where you would fall. You don't know who you are, whether you're a man or a woman, what your socioeconomic status is, what race or ethnicity you are. You don't know anything. You might be any of those. What is the optimal policy solution for you, right? This is a really cool concept, comes from philosophy, that if more, you know, of our elected officials and legislators used in formulating policy, we would have a lot better, healthier society, right? But the fact that, you know, when students are equipped with these tools and, you know, and have the energy and motivation, there is a truth to the generational change, right? And I think some of the concerns people have about the current generation are rooted in the fact that, you know, to Doug's point earlier, you know, this question that the 8th grader asked in the vice presidential debate, are they being socialized into to behave like, you know, to model the behavior of some of our current politicians who seem to be, you know, incapable of, and I don't think it's necessarily a fair argument to suggest that both parties are equally at fault, by the way. And I say this as a political scientist, as opposed to anybody with any kind of personal political views. You know, if, you know, I've borne witness to efforts to build bridges across the aisle in Congress a lot. And they're used to, you know, that is becoming less and less common. I mean, Biden, he had a really good relationship with people like Trent Lott, who adamantly opposed political views, right? But they found ways, John McCain, others, doing bipartisanship. And this is where, you know, Tanya's bipartisanship thing, it's possible. What we need are the next generations and to insist on better decorum and behavior than we currently have. And that's partly where I think the voters chime in as well. It'll be interesting to see what the election outcome has to do for the way that politics is run in the country. There's a lot at stake.
I'm glad you brought that up, Pat, because I always think about where have we gone wrong. We kind of went in a really negative direction, you know, with the hate, and people are so quick to say how they feel in a negative way, you know, versus listening and accepting, and don't comment if you feel differently in a negative way. You know, it's just being cordial and be able to talk and listen and have a conversation and dialogues and not blame and cuss and swear and then point fingers. Just you see more and more of that now. And I've visited with my sisters, and I think our Fab Five, I've shared this, is my sisters think differently than I do. But I had texted them, I want to talk to you, politics versus family. It's not who, I don't care, I care less about who you're going to support in the presidential race. I care more about you as my sisters, right, and how you're dealing with things. And so a place of compassion and caring versus screaming, yelling, pointing, swearing, that thing. But I've just seen a lot of that, and I just don't like it.
Yeah. You and me both. I agree with you. But this is where, when you go into conversations, I mean, when we talk about listening strategies, and I'm hoping, as part of this new leadership minor that the business department and political science have helped champion, one of the really critical skills is to learn, how to listen effectively, because leaders who can't listen well, end up being very different types of leaders if they are leaders at all. I think, with your sisters or with anybody, I mean, the first thing to do to really be present and listening is to suspend your agenda, because we all bring our own agendas and thoughts to the thing. But if you really want to understand them, you have to check that at the door and just genuinely be curious. A pathway to discovery. And I gave some of the, some of the questions in the Complicating the Narrative piece are good questions to ask to help understand them. That doesn't mean you need to be a total, you can still assert and engage, but you have to understand first before any engagement that you have in a conversation is going to resonate with, because so many times people don't feel understood or listened to. And that is absolutely critical to any healing that we'll have as a society, or in any other, familial structure or a institutional structure. So, yeah.
Yeah, and earlier when you were talking about like how do people like kind of get involved, or what are their first kind of influences, and I always think about family, and but then I think also too, like as much as we can, I mean, it's harder now with COVID-19, but like just try to meet as many people and get as many perspectives as we can. That's why I think a university or higher ed is such a cool place, because it brings together people with different backgrounds and different views, and I think that's a pretty cool piece of it too. But yeah. No, and it's funny. I'll just add one more comment, and then like we can get off here and get back to. It looks like the sun's actually coming out here down in Max, so people down in McMinnville can get outside this afternoon. But so I'm like, one thing I'm really torn on right now is college football. Like college football is probably my biggest like passion, like sport, as a fan, and what's happening at like Division I level with testing and not knowing, and like, is this healthy, is this the right thing to be doing right now, and the money implications. And so that's one where I'm like, and I always tell my students too in sport management, like sport and like fandom comes from fanatic, and there's a little bit crazy in there. And I think once we all kind of recognize like our biases, and I know people will always say, sports is my escape from from everything else. And it's like, I think more than ever now, we have to kind of face that reality of, is it really escape, or, I think it's a privilege if it's an escape, we had the quote of, Sean Doolittle from, we have it hanging up around HHPA about sport is like, the privilege of, or it's a reward for a functioning society. So I think we come back to that. But yeah, Pat, thank you so much. I learned a lot in just a short amount of time, and we're lucky to have you here in Linfield, and we can maybe do another session too as this kind of election season rolls on.
Anytime. Thank you all, and learn a lot from you guys as well. That's the whole great part of being part of this community. So thank you. Big heart to everyone, and
yes, everyone have a great weekend.
The sun.
Yes,
stay safe.
Yeah, bye everybody. Thank you.
Bye everybody.
Thanks.